How to weave romance into epic fantasy without losing the plot. So hi, my name is Shay Hulse. I am an indie and traditionally published fantasy romance author, and I help women like you write your romance novels you've always wanted and always dreamed of writing. And before we jump into today's topic, I wanted to share a little life update. So our internet was recently down for multiple days while it's being upgraded, and it was one of those moments that reminds you just how much of modern life depends on being connected. So I couldn't work my traditional 9 to 5. I work from home. I couldn't upload content. I couldn't work on my online business. Everything just kind of stopped for a bit, and honestly, it reminded me why I'm so passionate about building multiple streams of income and creating products that can work for me even when I'm not actively working, because life happens and technology fails, the internet goes down, and sometimes your plans get completely derailed, sometimes multiple times. So did I immediately become productive writing machine with all that extra time? Definitely not. I definitely took a lot of time procrastinating, cleaning the house, organizing things that definitely didn't even need to be touched. Then I found other things to clean, and then I started writing just a little bit before getting sidetracked. And then I kind of ran out of time to write too, but while I was working on my fantasy romance projects, I started thinking about something I see fantasy romance struggling with like all the time, is how do you weave romance into fantasy without losing the plot? Because if you're not careful, you can end up writing two separate stories that happen to share the same book. So let's talk about how to avoid that. The problem that most fantasy romance writers have is that one of the biggest mistakes I see is treating the fantasy plot and the romance plot like they're completely separate things. On the one side, you have kingdoms at war, and ancient prophecies, dark magic, political intrigue, dragons, all the fun stuff, witches, and world-ending disasters. And then on the other side, you have two people who are slowly falling in love. And the problem is that these storylines often feel disconnected. The fantasy scenes happen over here, and the romance scenes happen over there. And they rarely influence each other. But in the best fantasy romance novels, the romance and the fantasy are woven together so tightly that removing one would break the entire story. And that is the goal. So tip number 1 is let the romance create conflict. So a lot of writers think romance reduces tension. The truth is that great romance creates tension. So imagine your heroine is supposed to kill the enemy king. Simple mission until she falls in love with him. Now, every romantic movement complicates the fantasy plot. Or maybe your hero belongs to an ancient magical order, and your heroine is destined to destroy it. Now, every step toward love creates new problems. So the relationship becomes part of the conflict rather than a distraction from it. Also, use fantasy elements to increase romantic tension. So one of the greatest advantages fantasy romance writers have is access to incredible storytelling tools. Magic is one of them, curses, prophecies, ancient gods, magical bonds, dangerous quests. Use them, and maybe soulmates literally share magic. Maybe magical bond reveals every hidden emotion. Maybe an ancient prophecy says one lover will destroy the other. Maybe the only way to save the kingdom is through a political marriage. So your world building should actively make the romance more complicated. The fantasy shouldn't sit in the background. It should be stirring the plot. Then overlap the stakes. Here's a quick test. If your characters stopped being romantically involved tomorrow, would the fantasy plot stay exactly the same? So if the answer is yes, your story may need to be stronger. The best fantasy romance novels create overlapping stakes. So saving the kingdom might require sacrificing the person that they love. protecting their soulmate might put thousands of lives at risk. Choosing power could mean losing their relationship. Choosing love could mean losing everything else. So those impossible choices create unforgettable stories. And then stop treating romance like a side quest. So this is probably the most important lesson, is that romance is not a decoration. It's not glitter, sprinkled over the fantasy novel. It's a core story engine. It drives decisions, it creates conflict, raises the stakes, it forces growth, it changes outcomes. So when romance affects the fantasy plot and the fantasy plot affects the romance, readers become invested in both. And that is when books become impossible to put down, and that is when you are winning. So a quick exercise. If you're currently plotting a fantasy romance, answer these 3 questions. So how does the romance make the fantasy conflict worse? How does the fantasy conflict make the romance harder? And what emotional wound does the relationship force each character to confront? So if you can answer those questions clearly, you're already building a strong story. So I hope that this video helped you learn how to weave romance into your epic fantasy without losing your plot. And if you're currently starting from a blank page, wondering how to structure your romance story, I built something specifically for you. It's called Romancery. Romancery is my free web-based app designed to help fantasy romance writers plot their novels with a lot less stress. So inside it's 13 built-in romance plot points, along with popular romance tropes. So you can go from that first spark to the happily ever after. And whether you're writing enemies to lovers, forbidden romance, slow burn, forced proximity, or something completely unique, Romancery helps you build a stronger foundation before you start drafting. So you can find it for free at shayhulse.com. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what fantasy romance trope you're currently obsessed with. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye. Happy writing.